A boy evacuated from a city destroyed by air raids escapes from a train, finding himself in a semi-ruined settlement. There he must find his way home despite constant bombings and the threat from marauding gangs. The film begins with a brief overview of Operation Blitz, a massive airstrike campaign by Germany against Britain in September 1940, during which more than 1,250,000 people were evacuated to rural areas. In London, fires rage after air raids, and fire brigades desperately fight to flames, holding heavy hoses under water pressure while German aircraft continue to attack the capital. Due to another air raid alarm, a boy named George, along with his mother Rita and grandfather, set out in the middle of the night to find shelter, like many other townspeople. However, upon arriving at the shelter, they find it closed, and the soldiers refuse to let anyone in. A crowd forms and the guards, disobeying orders, decide to let the civilians into the empty underground station. Descending, the family settles down for the night along with their cat Ollie, whom George managed to bring from home in a carrier. The next day, Rita makes the difficult decision to send George to a safe village despite his resistance. As a keepsake, she gives him a pendant that his father had once given her. The grandfather sees his daughter and grandson off from the house, and on their way, they meet their neighbor Jack, who works as a policeman and has taken a short leave from service. Rita leads George through the streets of London, while George gets distracted, watching the barrage balloons floating in the sky and examining the anti-aircraft guns set up along the streets. Finally, they reach the station, where children are being evacuated, loaded into carriages. The mother hangs a ticket around George's neck, but George, frustrated by the forced trip, yells that he hates her and runs away, getting lost in the crowd. A worried Rita finds him already sitting in the carriage. George, still upset, doesn't even look at her as the train starts moving. Saddened by the separation, Rita returns to the factory, where she works, making shells for the front. Her colleagues try to support her, but the supervisor quickly ends the conversation, reminding everyone to get back to work. The rest of the day is spent in painstaking labor, the result of which is a batch of aerial bombs. At the end of the shift, a brass band and equipment for a live radio broadcast arrive at the factory, organized as part of a program to boost public morale. At the factories, talented workers get performances on the radio, and Rita has the honor of representing her factory. She dedicates her song to her son and to all the parents separated from their children. By the evacuation, her performance ends with applause and workers demanding that more underground stations be opened as bomb shelters. Meanwhile, on the train moving through picturesque English landscapes, two boys start picking on George. George shows his character and challenges them to a fight, which scares off the bullies. Left alone, he falls into sad memories of how he was teased in London for being mixed race. Taking advantage of a moment when the conductor leaves the carriage, George decides to escape, aiming to find his way home on his own. George approaches the carriage door, first opening the window, then the door itself. He throws out his suitcase and then jumps down the embankment from the moving train. Rolling down, George waves after the departing train before setting off along the tracks on foot towards home. When a passing train catches up to him, George throws away his suitcase, keeping only some food, and sneaks into a freight car. Inside, he finds three other resourceful boys. During their introduction, George learns that they are brothers who ran away when authorities tried to separate them. George shares his sandwich, explaining that he is trying to get back home. His new friends warn him that if he gets caught, there won't be a second chance to escape. They'll be watching him. The brothers encourage George to climb onto the roof of the carriage through the hatch, and he easily agrees. One by one, the others follow to enjoy the ride on the roof. Random passers-by wave to the young travelers, greeting them. Exhausted, the children lay down to sleep, and upon waking, they discover that the train is standing on a London siding. Workers are checking the carriages for stowaways. They manage to escape from an old man who almost catches one of them. While fleeing, George freezes in fear at the sight of an approaching locomotive. One of his companions tries to encourage him, not noticing the approaching engine, and dies right before the eyes of his brothers and George. The remaining brothers run in one direction, while a stunned George rushes to the station, where he climbs into a departing bus. At the factory, following a broadcast, the management summons activists to participate in an impromptu live segment. As Rita prepares to head home after her shift, she recalls the time she partied in a tavern with Marcus, George's father. It was then that he gave her a family heirloom, a pendant that belonged to his mother, which Rita would later pass on to her son. On their way home from the tavern late at night, the couple encounters a group of workers who mock Marcus because of his Afro-British heritage. This escalates into a fight, which is broken up by arriving police officers. One of the bobbies arrests Marcus on assault charges, disregarding Rita's testimony. On a bus, George asks the conductor how to get to a church. The woman explains where and how he needs to transfer. The boy gets off at the next stop to find the correct route. His attention is drawn to a shop window displaying a tow train set, but a police officer chases him away. George continues walking, kicking a pebble along the path, and eventually reaches a shopping center where he sees stained glass windows depicting British history, including scenes of his ancestors' enslavement. There, a black police officer named Eve finds him and takes him to the station. Eve asks George where he lives and learns that it's in another part of the city. The officer takes George on his patrol, promising to bring him home afterward. Meanwhile, Rita and her colleagues plan an evening stroll to the tavern to relax and have a drink. They try to mingle with soldiers and sailors on leave. However, Rita isn't in the mood for romantic adventures, so when her friend brings sailors to their table, she decides to head home. On her way back, she stumbles upon a socialist gathering where Mickey Davis, a proponent of Christian socialism, is raising funds to support a shelter for the underprivileged. Rita tells Mickey she wants to volunteer to help the wounded and those in need. Her first task is to provide moral support to a little girl whose mother died in a bombing. During the patrol, George tells Eve he's never met his father, as he was deported before George was born. Noticing a light in a window, Eve knocks on the door to ask the resident to turn off the electricity. Adhering to London's blackout orders to prevent enemy aircraft from finding targets, soon an air raid siren blares, and Eve and George rush to the nearest shelter, already crowded with people. Eve escorts George inside, where there are beds and a food station, while George uses a bucket as a makeshift toilet. Tensions among the shelter's occupants arise over a sheet separating native Britons from immigrants. Eve intervenes to quell the conflict, reminding everyone that Hitler also divides people into right and wrong races. He then puts George to bed, promising to return for him in the morning after his shift. As George falls asleep, he recalls how his mother and grandfather taught him to play the piano. The next morning, George is awakened by a call to rise and shine. He asks one of the officers about Eve's whereabouts, but is invited into a makeshift den by local children. From the den, he overhears adults talking and learns that Eve died during the night while trying to save an elderly woman, unable to reach the shelter before the bombing. George hides from the officers and then runs off into the devastated city, where fires rage everywhere from the German air raids. Rita walks to work through streets reduced to ruins overnight. A brick wall nearly collapses on her, but her neighbor Jack saves her just in time. Before she can fully start her shift, Rita is called to the office by her boss, who delivers grim news. George didn't reach his destination. All they know is that he jumped off the train and waved goodbye as he ran away. Furious, Rita blames the transport staff for her son's disappearance and leaves work, despite her boss's protests, to search for George in the city. Meanwhile, George roams London, peering into shop windows. A girl named Jess, who is also biracial, notices him. She offers him candy and promises to feed him in exchange for his name. Jess takes him to a billiard hall and hands him over to Albert, who immediately decides to use the boy for illicit activities. George is tasked with crawling through a hole in a wall to loot a jewelry store. George tries to escape but is caught and threatened with dire consequences for another attempt. He squeezes through a narrow gap into the bomb-damaged store. As he collects valuables, police burst in and move a cabinet to block the hole, preventing entry from outside. The officers are about to leave when they notice some items missing from the display case. After the bombing, realizing he might be caught, George deliberately triggers a collapse of debris to create a distraction. Despite this, one persistent officer insists on checking the room. Only a second collapse convinces him to abandon the search, and they leave, allowing George to drag his haul back to the criminals alone. George asks Albert to take him home, which unexpectedly triggers a burst of anger. Albert strikes the boy and then, as if possessed, starts hitting himself in the face until his acquaintance calms him down with a song. Albert orders Jess to watch over the boy and reward him with a piece of cake. Meanwhile, Rita, having returned home to inform her father, sets off in search of her son. She first turns to her neighbor Jack, and together they head to the train station to start the search there. However, no one has seen or heard anything. Their unsuccessful search is interrupted by yet another air raid siren, audible even in a restaurant where people had been trying to celebrate. They hear the warning but fail to escape in time. The building is bombed. Amid the ruins and bodies, Albert's looting gang is scavenging valuables from the deceased. George, forced to work with them, is tasked with moving the bodies, though he clearly doesn't want to. Seizing an opportunity, George runs off into the night and hides by the riverside. He watches as German planes soar overhead, bombs descend, and fires rage across the city. When an explosion erupts too close, the frightened boy sprints across a bridge, narrowly avoiding death as a downed plane crashes nearby. George keeps running through the fiery, chaotic streets of London, where firefighters struggle to minimize the damage and panicked citizens scatter. Reaching a metro entrance, George descends and finds other children watching a puppet show in a makeshift theater. He ventures further into the station and encounters police officers, trying unsuccessfully to disperse the overcrowded shelter. He makes his way down to the tracks and stretches out between the rails, wrapping himself in a stranger's blanket to rest. Rito, meanwhile, rides out the bombing at Mickey's shelter, where the gathered crowd sings together to fend off fear. Jack is also there, though he regards the socialists with suspicion. After the raid, Rita walks through the shelter, searching for a quiet corner to cry over her struggles and misfortunes. Waking earlier than the others, George follows the metro tracks deeper into the tunnel, eventually reaching the next station. There, a crowd listens to a women's trio performing hymns. George sees a friend who died under a train and Officer Ife, but this turns out to be a dream. He wakes up again between the tracks and notices a puddle forming on the floor. Suddenly, a torrent of water breaks through the station wall. It's flooding from the River Thames. The panicked crowd rushes to the exit, pushing George into the turbulent waters. He runs toward the stairs, but is washed back down by a powerful stream of water. Soon the lights go out, adding confusion and fear of the dark to the chaos. Using flashlights, people struggle to find the exit. George moves with the crowd, but encounters a gate chain shut on the other side. Men manage to partially pry the gate open and urge George to crawl through to unlock it from the other side. George dives but gets stuck underwater. Rita heads home, and Jack leaves her to return to the station. At home, she checks her father's bedroom, where he's asleep with their cat, and then her son's room, which is still empty. She gazes out the window despondently, unaware that another German squadron is flying over the English Channel at that very moment. George wakes up in a bed. The landlady tells him he saved many lives the night before by calling for help. She promises to feed him and take him home. Wearing the lucky pendant around his neck, George hears a knock at the door. It's the police, coming for him. Not wanting to get caught, he escapes through the window and runs through the streets once again. Recognizing a familiar neighborhood, he smiles with relief as he makes his way home through the bustling crowd. However, his street was bombed overnight, and his house is destroyed. Only the family cat survived. Amid the ruins, George finds his grandfather's lifeless body. He calls out to him but gets no response. Suddenly, he hears his mother's voice. She has survived. The woman embraces George, overwhelmed with joy, and promises never to be separated from him again. The camera pans out, showing the reunited family against the backdrop of the city devastated by German bombs. The film ends here. Thank you for watching until the end.